Right. Hey, welcome everyone. This is Caitlin Coleman. I'm Water Education Colorado's Publications and Digital Resources Managing Editor, and we're really excited to present today's webinar on the Upper Colorado and San Juan Rivers Endangered Fish Recovery Programs. As you likely know, we have some amazing speakers this afternoon, but before we get started and introduce them, I would like to welcome and introduce you to Sabrina White, our new Programs Director.
Hi, everyone. As Caitlin said, my name is Sabrina White. I am now the Programs Director for Water Education Colorado. And I just want to thank you all for being here today. We're excited to share more information on a few of the initiatives happening right now in Colorado, protecting our endangered species. And you know, it's really important information for us all to stay up to date on. So yeah. You'll learn a lot today about some efforts to support endangered species protection and conservation, but you can also learn more about these efforts through our Headwaters magazine. Caitlin will talk more about that magazine, but we're touching on topics today that are covered in depth in our Fall 22 issue. You can access that on our website, which is watereducationcolorado.org. Digitally, and then we also have print copies that members are automatically signed up to receive. Please feel free to reach out to me or to Caitlin if you have any questions about our publications or need help getting a copy. And finally, Caitlin has put together a great suite of speakers today, so please join me in welcoming them and learning from their expertise. And thank you all again for being here.
Thanks, Sabrina. So next, I'd like to thank the Colorado Water Conservation Board for their support on this webinar. Of course, we have great speakers from the CWCB, but also financial support from them. So thank you. A few, really basic logistics. Please remain muted during our presentations. We'll allow about 15 minutes for Q&A at the end of our time together. So at that point, you can turn on your camera if you want. Usually people just use the chat to type in questions, but if you want to raise your hand and ask a question verbally, that's great too. And of course, the webinar is being recorded. We'll share the recording by early next week. So I think that's all the logistics. So on to our topic. As many of you know, and as Sabrina kind of mentioned, we try to organize a webinar to take each issue of Headwaters magazine off the page and to dive deeper into the subject matter. So this webinar corresponds with our Fall 2022 issue, which was focused on the federal nexus with Colorado Water. Of course, we covered a really wide range of topics and programs and agencies and funding resources in that issue. But we also took a look at endangered fish recovery programs. And of course, as most of us know, they're up for reauthorization this year. So it feels like a really timely and important and interesting topic to focus on. So that's what we're doing here today. We'll hear from 4 great speakers today. We'll start off by hearing from Julie Stolle with the Endangered Fish Recovery Programs. Then we'll hear from Michelle Garrison with the Colorado Water Conservation Board. Then we'll shift into a short discussion between Bart Miller with Western Resource Advocates and Steve Wolf with the Southwestern Water Conservation District. So with that, I'm really pleased to introduce Julie Stolle, Director of the Upper Colorado River Endangered Fish Recovery Program. Julie.
Thanks, Caitlin. I really appreciate the opportunity and the forum to speak here today. This program is one that has become very near and dear to my heart. And I think spreading the word about it is always really helpful from our perspective. I just want to double check and make sure that you guys can see the presentation that I'm sharing on my screen. Can somebody nod? Okay, thank you. All right, so I am here to talk about both my program, which is the Upper Colorado River Endangered Fish Recovery Program, and our San Juan River Basin Recovery Implementation Program, which is our sister program to the south. So these programs were established in 1988 and 1992 respectively, and really came out of a lot of discussions between how everyone was going to get through the conflict between these species that were becoming endangered in the Colorado River and the law of the river that had been established for a long time that was sort of operating independently of the newly formed Endangered Species Act. The programs came out of a pretty unusual suggestion from Colorado Water Congress water users, who basically said that there didn't have to be conflict here, and we could figure out how to walk the line between both the Endangered Species Act and the law of the river at the same time. And the way they figured out to do that was to actually seek recovery and dealing of the species while still allowing water development to continue in the basin. So under a lot of jeopardy decisions in the Endangered Species Act, essentially what the Fish and Wildlife Service is asking for is, please stop doing the thing that you are doing that is endangering these species until we can recover them. And this sort of pairs those two things together to say, we still need water for agriculture. We need water for municipalities. We need it for all sorts of ways that people are developing across the West. And so not using water is really not an option. So the other option is we just work really hard at recovering these species while using the water at the same time. So what that has turned into 35 years later is what is on this slide, which is a little busy, but I think the combination of all of these things is really important. So we have never had a water project halted or postponed because of the ESA. We work really hard to help all of our water users navigate the permitting process from an Endangered Species Act protection or perspective, and making sure that we are all working together to make sure that the water users have what they need and the fish have what they need. We also have had 0 lawsuits for any partner regarding ESA compliance in the Upper Basin. So we have 35 years of really collaborative action that has been amenable to a wide variety of partners, meaning that we've been able to keep litigation out of that conversation. From a Section 7 perspective, which is the section of the Endangered Species Act that governs a lot of these actions, we provide streamlined compliance that allows a lot of these water development projects to continue. And we do that by serving as an applicant committed conservation measure. So basically what that means is that the program is charged with implementing actions on the ground that help recover those species. And then that serves the water users' needs for ESA compliance. It also means that our consultations are strategic and integrated, so we can look at a lot of these different consultations together rather than one by one. And from a fisheries perspective, what that means is that we've really gotten on the ground success for these species. We have partners who are working collaboratively and diligently to try to enhance flows, get more flow in the river, build habitat and manage it for endangered species. And that a lot of these projects that we're working on to specifically target those endangered species also have benefits for irrigators, anglers, recreationists, and a whole lot of users along all of the rivers in the Upper Basin and the San Juan. And essentially what this gets to is instead of fighting and litigating back and forth about which should win between the Endangered Species Act and water use in the Upper Basin, we've really gotten to a place where our collective actions mean that we can do more together than any agency could do by itself. So I want to review the coverage area of where we are. The Upper Colorado River Recovery Program serves the states of Wyoming, Utah, and Colorado. We work primarily in the Colorado and Upper Green drainages that cover those areas. We also, by extension, serve a lot of the water users that exist outside of this bubble because of a lot of the trans-mountain diversions that do take water out of this system and into neighboring watersheds. The San Juan River Recovery Implementation Program is shown here in the red outline, and they work in the San Juan River Basin, serving New Mexico, Colorado, and the state of Utah as a new partner just this year. Here's a list of all of our by themselves, and you'll hear from a couple of them later today as to how they view the program. But basically, one of the successes of this program, of these programs, and how it's really worked is that the founders looked around and tried to get as many views at the table as possible. So we have multiple state perspectives, tribal perspectives in the San Juan, federal government perspectives, environmental groups, water users, power users. The goal was to have enough voices at the table to make sure that we were covering the broad range of perspectives that were affected by the actions of this program, and really bring them to the table to have those tough conversations about what we're going to do first and what we're going to do second, and how all those things line out. Has really become the foundation of success in these programs. The Upper Colorado program covers 4 listed fish species, and then the San Juan is covers the 2 that are starred here. So I'm going to start with the bony tail, which is sort of flying at you in the upper left-hand corner of these dots. The bony tail was listed as endangered in 1980. It was the last one to be listed, or it was one of the later ones to be listed because they had actually thought that it had gone extinct. So once a population of bony tail was found in the lower basin, they brought them into hatcheries, discovered that that species was still on the landscape, and we've been trying to bring it back ever since then. It's one of our most challenging species because it had depleted so far by the time that we got to it, that we don't know a lot about what it needs from a habitat or life history standpoint. The next one up to the right is the Colorado pike minnow. It was listed endangered in 1973 as part of the original Endangered Species Act list. It's the only predator in the Colorado River Basin, pretty unique because it has teeth in its throat rather than its mouth. And it used to be able to grow to about 6 feet long, moving all the way from the Upper Colorado River system all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico and back again. They only grow to about 4 feet now, but are still present in all 3 basins in the Upper Colorado. The next one is the humpback chub. It was also listed as endangered in 1973 as part of that original list. It has now been downlisted to threatened because of a couple of dynamics. One is stabilizing populations in the upper basin, and there's also some pretty incredible massive populations in the lower basin in the Grand Canyon. So it was just reclassified to a threatened species in 2021. And then the last one we're looking at here is the razorback sucker. It was listed endangered in 1991. It was the latest of the species to be listed because there were large populations in the reservoirs in the lower basin all the way through the 1990s. It has also been proposed for reclassification to be moved down to threatened, but that process is still in the works and has not been finalized from the Fish and Wildlife Service yet. The work comes in the form of these 7 program elements. So we work with program partners to get actions in in-stream flow areas. We do a lot of habitat restoration, which primarily looks at flooded bottomlands to serve razorback sucker and bony tail, looking at passages over dam facilities to make sure that we're connecting all the habitat that we can, and screening irrigation ditches to make sure that we're not getting individuals caught in those areas so they don't end up in farmers' fields. We do a lot of non-native fish control. There are a number of non-native predators that have been introduced into the system that can eat all of these endangered fish through most of their life stages. And so trying to figure out how to contain those non-native fish is one of our biggest, if not our largest challenge in the basin at the moment. We do propagate some of the species. Right now, Colorado pike minnow in the San Juan Basin, razorback sucker and bony tail are all grown in hatcheries and released onto the landscape in an attempt to bring those populations back to have wild populations occurring naturally in the wild. And we have information and education efforts that help broaden the scope of our reach and help us get a little bit of support from the folks on the landscape who can really help us navigate a lot of the changes that are needed to help support these species in the basin. All of those areas are guided by research and monitoring. We track what we do, what works, what doesn't work, and try and adapt as quickly as possible to get the species what they need on the ground. And then we've got the boring part of program management, making sure that we are trying to get all of these things coordinated in a way that allows action to be happening in all of them at the same time. So one of the questions that we get most often is what's the difference between the programs and the Fish and Wildlife Service? Because we, all of our program offices are housed within the Fish and Wildlife Service, but we really are centered on managing this adaptive management program that allows for all of these actions to happen on the landscape. So Fish and Wildlife Service still maintains control over recovery plans and recovery goals for that species. And every year they assess sufficient progress on our progress. So the Fish and Wildlife Service looks at the actions that are being completed by all of those program partners and determine whether or not we get to continue because we are making sufficient progress towards recovery or not. And so we have sort of the Fish and Wildlife Service voice in the back of our heads as we conduct a lot of these actions, making sure that we are doing as much as we can to support the species on the ground through our annual work plans. And then the Fish and Wildlife Service also conducts what they call species status assessments, which are documents that combine a lot of the scientific resources about the species themselves and 5-year reviews that suggest downlisting or delisting of the species. So all of those efforts are informed by the efforts of the program, but they're managed outside of the program and include information outside of our 2 programs and across the distribution of the species. So I know that was a very quick view of what happens in the program. Before we get to Michelle and talking about reauthorization and what happens in our future post 2023, I wanted to open it up for questions. It looks like there might be one in the chat. Are they still found in Mexico? I'm not sure what that was referring to, maybe Colorado pike minnow. There are no Colorado pike minnow currently downstream of Glen Canyon Dam, so they are limited to the upper basin alone.
This is Reed Dills. I noticed that you're involving the tribes, but the past history, maybe not with your group, but with Colorado River System in the past, as they've been given lip service. Has that changed?
I don't know that I can comment on that on a broader scale, but the San Juan program has had tribal partners from the very beginning, and they are very integrally involved in a lot of the actions that are occurring in that program. They actually do a lot of actions in regard to propagation and stocking. So they much of the work that happens in that program happens on Navajo lands, and they are working day in and day out with those tribal partners to make sure that everything conforms to all of their regulations and supports their actions as a tribal nation before any of that work is completed. So they are integral partners, just as all of the other members of the San Juan program are.
Reed, this is Christine Arbogast, and I represent the 2 tribes, and they do not feel that way. They're very intimately involved and have been from the very creation of the program.
Thank you, Christine. And
appreciate your concern about that.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right.
Glad to hear that.
Thank you, Julie. And thanks for the questions. We'll have time for more questions at the end. So if you have other thoughts for Julie, type them into the chat or write them down, and you can ask them as we finish up. So next, I would like to welcome Michelle Garrison. She'll share more about the reauthorization of the programs. Of course, Michelle is a water resources specialist with the Colorado Water Conservation Board. She sits on the management committee of the Upper Colorado River Endangered Fish Recovery Program. Welcome, Michelle.
Thank you, everybody. And I apologize. Julie put all the cool pictures in her presentation, and I have no cool pictures of reauthorization or funding. So bear with me and we'll try to go quick, but we'll talk about how that relates. And I'd like you to remember the graphic that Julie showed about how the programs and then the other pieces of Fish and Wildlife Service and the findings they need to make and the goals they need to set, how those work together. Because I think one of the questions I was supposed to cover is a little bit of what's at stake. And I think pieces of that process are what's at stake when we look at making sure that these programs continue to function and provide this same coverage and continue to work on recovering the species that they have done in the past. So we want to continue the success that Julie talked about. And I might have to have somebody else pull up my slides because I cannot advance them, even though it worked in the trial. There we go.
I'm working on getting them open right now, Michelle.
So I'll stop sharing because they're not advancing.
All right, are you seeing them now?
Yes, thanks, Caitlin. Next slide, please. There we go. And so I want to first talk about some of the pieces of the structure for funding the programs. And the initial development of the programs resulted in these cooperative agreements. Julie went through all the partners that are involved in the programs and are very, very active. Certain partners were also part of these initial cooperative agreements that discuss kind of how the programs will function, how these partners will function, and any funding the partners are bringing to the table. So the cooperative agreements are an important piece for the Upper Colorado. The cooperative agreement signatories are the states of Colorado, Wyoming, and Utah, the Secretary of Interior, and Western Area Power Administration. For the San Juan, the signatories are the states of Colorado, New Mexico, and Utah. The Navajo Nation, the Southern Ute Indian Tribe, the Ute Mountain Ute Indian Tribe, and the Jicarilla Apache Nation, and the Secretary of Interior. And so those are the agreements that we have. And if you could push forward again, those tie back to some of the program documents, and those expire September of 2023. So that's one important piece that we have to get through this year. And get everything put together so that those cooperative agreements can be renewed between these partners. The next piece I want to talk about is authorization. When we talk about authorization for the program, what we're really talking about is federal legislation that authorized reclamation to provide cost sharing for these programs. And that means that reclamation can request, receive, and spend money on these programs. And that's what we needed. Other federal agencies, Fish and Wildlife Service, can put some of that funding for the programs in their budget. But there's this piece that started with PL 106-392 that works on the reclamation piece of the funding for these programs, which is critical. Reclamation has a huge footprint in these two programs. They have a lot of projects in the basin, which also receive compliance. And it's been just an incredible partnership. And we need reclamation to continue to be able to request, receive, and spend those funds. And so that really, when we talk about reauthorization, that's what the reauthorization is for. And then there's the federal appropriations piece, and that happens annually. The Fish and Wildlife Service and Reclamation every year have a budget. They start 3 years before that. So they have to plan out what they think the expenses will be, the budget for the programs, 3 years in advance, and work their way through the federal budget process until that comes out in the president's budget. And then you can work on receiving appropriations for that year to spend under your authorization. And so that's the process we go through. Does it every year. The federal agencies make their requests, budget comes out. The non-federal partners brief their congressional delegations to try to get support for those appropriations. We've been very successful so far in getting what the program needs into the president's budget, and then getting appropriations for those needs. So it's been successful so far. It needs to continue to be successful. Next slide, please. So we've gone through quite an extensive post-2023 planning process for the programs. And the first part of that was that each program spent quite a bit of time thinking about their program needs post-2023. And they convened work groups. They chose a planning timeline of 15 years, and they really worked through with subject matter experts, looking at all the activities they currently do and the need to promote species recovery, and thinking about how much, what types of activities they needed to continue to do post-2023, and then what the expected expenses of those would be, so that they could look at their needs for funding for both annual, which annual funding is kind of the operations of the program, the types of things they do every year. So if you remember Julie's slide about all the different components, in-stream flow or genetics and propagation or habitat, all those things that they do, all those components require funding under annual funding. And then there's also capital funding, and that allows for construction of things like fish ladders and fish screens. Fish ladders can be built around diversion structures to allow fish passage back into habitat that's been cut off by a diversion structure, and fish screens prevent entrainment into diversion structures. So both programs have built several of those. They work very well, but they require capital funding. They require annual funding for operation and maintenance. So those types of things have to be considered when you look at the overall future budget. We convened a funding work group made up of members of committees of both programs. They talked about a reauthorization period and decided to keep the same 15-year period as the planning timeline. They talked about historical and future funding. Historical funding, for a long time, the programs were able to rely pretty frequently on hydropower revenue from the Colorado River Storage Project Act reservoirs. So mostly Glen Canyon Dam, but also Flaming Gorge and Aspinall produce power that goes into a basin fund that under the CRISP Act, water money is owed back to the Treasury to repay the construction of those projects. And money that was owed back to the Treasury to repay those projects was allowed to be given instead to reclamation to pay for elements of the program. And so that's considered what's called the constructive return. And that was the mechanism for a long time for funding these programs. That mechanism is going away, both because of drought, which has just hammered hydropower revenue and the basin fund from the CRISP reservoirs, but also constructive returns diminish over time because you are continuing to pay those projects back. So both of those things needed to be taken into consideration when we looked at what the future funding of the program was like, should look like. And we spent quite a bit of time exploring possible future funding sources and ideas everybody had about what might be able to be tapped, particularly to replace those declining hydropower revenue funds. For the first time, because we were no longer funding it either from hydropower revenue for many, many years or in a couple of recent years as a backstop reclamation appropriations, there was a need to identify the San Juan Tribal Trust responsibility separately from just the full funding of the program for the first time. So there was quite a bit of discussion about how to figure out what dollar amount to assign to that. And in the end, they decided to look at the hydrologic model for the San Juan program and what percentage of the depletions in the model are attributed to the tribes, and identify it that way. But it was quite a process and something new, and we couldn't find precedent for it somewhere else. So it took some time and some smart people to figure that out. And finally then worked towards some funding proposals. The first thing that came out was some news about how much hydropower revenue to expect in the future, and some of Reclamation's priorities. And then, a proposal from Reclamation, and then a proposal from the states, and then working together with some ideas from other folks, working together on actually then a joint funding proposal that everyone that will be paying can agree to, and then share with the rest of the program and make sure everybody is comfortable. So we're almost finished with that process. Finally, we will have a joint funding proposal that folks are looking at. We're working out the final little dotting I's and crossing T's, but we're there, and I'll talk about what's in that. And then the reauthorization legislation. Moving forward, that's the key piece to allow Reclamation to continue to be able to fund these programs. So we're currently working on the draft language. It needs to match the funding proposals in some key pieces, in key places. We need to find sponsors, and usually the program tries to find co-sponsors from both sides of the aisle in both the House and the Senate. So we're looking for a minimum of 2 sponsors in the House, 2 sponsors in the Senate, all from the basin states that are involved in the programs, and then try to get consensus support from all the other basin state legislators. And then it has to work its way through the legislative process, and we have to work with the sponsors and the rest of our congressional delegation through the entire process. I just listed a couple pieces of that here. The bill has to get introduced, committees, hearings, questions, amendments, and then whether or not it's going to be packaged into something else, some bigger bill, et cetera, and that has to happen in both the House and the Senate. So it can be pretty time consuming, and sometimes if we're just talking about the appropriations, it can go pretty fast, but sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it gets held up, as it did recently when we just needed to make one tweak to the legislation for a year. It took a lot longer than we thought because Congress got caught up in some other big things, and so the exact time frame of that is still unknown. And then as part of that, part of the congressional delegation said they'd like to see some sort of economic benefit study to help support an understanding amongst other congressional members about the benefits of this program and why it's appropriate to be asking for federal funds for these programs. Next slide, please. Can I get the next slide? Did I?
Sorry, I'm having trouble advancing them.
Okay, it's not just me. I don't know what happened.
There we go.
So really quickly, and then I'll wrap up. What's in the current joint funding proposal is the 15-year reauthorization period, and a piece on capital funding, and a piece on annual funding, and a piece on in-kind contributions that are all key pieces of what those signatories to the cooperative agreements are going to bring to the programs, as well as some mention of how other contributions by other non-federal partners will be considered. So for capital funding, for the first time, instead of identifying a capital ceiling for each program, we looked at a joint ceiling of 100 million for both programs. And then all these numbers that I'm giving you, just as a reminder, that's all in 2024 dollars, and then they should all be adjusted annually for inflation. Next, up to 100 million in appropriations from Reclamation for this capital funding. Carryover of any remaining existing appropriations and carryover of any unutilized ceiling, so that we can roll those into the next 15-year period, don't have to give that money back or not utilize the little bit of ceiling we have left for the San Juan program now. And that the non-federal partners will continue to provide funding on a project-by-project basis, subject to funding availability. And so when the programs were first put together, most of the funding from the non-federal partners came in the form of capital funding. And the signatories met all of their obligations several years ago, if not earlier, to provide that initial tranche of capital funding, and then have continued in some cases on a project-by-project basis to provide some additional capital funding. And some other non-federal partners, such as the NGOs, have provided some capital funding for particular projects. And so we expect that to continue, but there's nothing in the current joint proposal about a specified amount of capital funding coming from anybody besides reclamation. It will happen, there's just not an estimate or an obligation specified. And since we're doing now a joint ceiling, we're gonna have joint meetings from the committees of both programs to work with reclamation on the planning and scheduling of the different projects that are going to be constructed or repaired under this capital funding. And then a note that if for some reason $100 million in capital funding plus inflation is insufficient in that 15-year window, the non-federal partners will seek additional ceiling. Next slide, please. So here are the numbers for annual funding. For the upper program, 9.7 million per year. For the San Juan program, 4.21 million per year. Over 15 years, that adds up to a little over $208 million. Where's it going to come from? Federal funding, Fish and Wildlife Service, $23.4 million. The Tribal Trust for the San Juan, which will currently be covered by reclamation, 39.3 million. Reclamation and other, 124.7 million roughly. And when I say other, Park Service had expressed an interest at one point in perhaps starting to appropriate some funds for the program. There were some discussions ongoing about whether or not hydropower revenue might come back into play at some point, and other things. So if other federal or quasi-federal, I know hydropower revenue is paid by customers, but then to the Treasury, so that's a little odd distinction. But if other federal funding becomes available, reclamation can reduce the amount they pay, offset that by an equal amount. But for now, reclamation has agreed to cover these expenses outside of what the Fish and Wildlife Service has agreed to cover. So there we are. And the way the proposals put out right now, reclamation and Fish and Wildlife Service cover the entire amount for the first 5 years. And then reclamation's amount starts shrinking and the state funding starts increasing. So it gives the states 5 years to be prepared to come up with this new amount. While we were going through these funding talks during COVID, some of the state budgets cratered. And it was very difficult to figure out how some states could bounce back and get money into the program by 2024, even though they're very interested in holding up their part of the bargain. And so that was a very generous concession by the feds to help cover for the first 5 years so that the states that really had some significant budgetary issues can work their way back and make their payments. So that leads us to the state funding portion. In the Upper Colorado, the 3 state partners already provide $500 million a year in cash equivalent. And so they pay for things the program otherwise would have paid for, or they pay themselves to do the work that the program was otherwise going to do and pay for. Key piece of that the program otherwise was going to do and pay for, right? It has to be in a work, it was going to be in a work plan, it was going to be in the budget, and a state picks that up. That'll total $7.5 million, an additional cash or cash equivalent from the states of $13.75 million. And importantly, if we go to appropriations instead of hydropower revenue, it's much harder for the feds to spend a little less one year and a little more a different year and roll some of those funds over and things like that. And so the state portion of the funding needs to be flexible for both the states who have to get this money from their legislatures and might get more one year or less the next year, and also for the program if there needs to be some cushion or ability in a certain year if federal appropriations are late or something. There has to be some cushion there, and so we're still working through how much cushion we need. But again, those additional state contributions will kick in by year 6 and increase across that 15-year period. And then there's the in-kind contributions, which is other things that all the partners do for the programs that helps make them function that weren't part of the original budget. And we anticipate that those, including contributions of water, staffing, funding for things that benefit the program but weren't in the budget, which could be diversion repairs, that it could be a lot of different things that have happened. We're estimating that to be over 175 million. The use of Navajo Nation land is another good example of that. Some of them are hard to monetize, but there are a lot of things that partners bring to the table to keep things functioning that we want to make sure Congress understands we think is equivalent to some of the federal cash funding. And last slide, I think, because I'm out of time. So we've talked a little bit about the legislation. We've got to get that taken care of by September. And that is always a real wild card in terms of trying to figure out how long that will take. We've got to finalize the details of the state annual funding. We've committed to the final amount, but the details about how much each state will pay in each year are still being worked out by the states. And then we've got to get that into the program documents that outline those things that then the cooperative agreements refer to. And in the meantime, so the legislation, the things at the top, legislation all the way through economic benefits study, those will be running on one course. And at the same time, we'll be working on the final details of the state annual funding. The program is working on their environmental assessment that they've been told they need to update. Given this, and then we need to update the program documents with that information and update the cooperative agreements all by September 30th. So that is the timeline we are now on to make sure these things continue to function. And that's the end of my presentation, finally. So thank you. If there are any quick questions.
Thanks, Michelle. Let's hold questions. And I guess I would encourage everyone, you know, if our speakers are available and you are able to stick around a little bit beyond 2, we might run over and take time for questions there. And if you're listening in and you have an important question, you can't stay past 2, type it into the chat and we'll try to answer it. And we'll just go from there. So last but not least, I am excited to welcome Bart Miller and Steve Wolf. Steve serves as the general manager of the Southwestern Water Conservation District. And prior to this position, he was the Interstate Streams Division Administrator for the Wyoming State Engineer's Office, where he served as chair of the management committee of the Upper Colorado River Endangered Fish Recovery Program. And then Bart is the director of Western Resource Advocates Healthy Rivers Program. He's been with Western Resource Advocates since 2000, where he manages a talented team of experts who work together to protect healthy rivers, improve water efficiency, recover endangered species, and more. So we're going to turn to Bart and Steve for a little conversation now that we've established some basics about the program. I would like Bart and Steve to kind of explain how they fit in and who they're representing here today, and then describe their community's interest in participating.
Thanks, Caitlin. I'll jump in and give a quick update or explanation of our involvement. So yeah, Western Resource Advocates, along with the Nature Conservancy, are the conservation organizations that are part of the programs. And I personally have been involved for 20 years, and folks might remember the name Dan Lukey. He worked with us for a number of years on the program as well. And the reason we're involved is really about the fish and their longevity. They've been around not just for thousands of years, but for millions of years. And I think it's up to us that our generation is not the one that sees them disappear from the face of the planet. They're species that only exist in the Colorado River Basin, nowhere else in the world. And so I think I found for folks who remember or have read any Aldo Leopold, he has a great little quote about the conservation ethic. And he says it basically enlarges the boundaries of how we define community to include soil, water, plants, and animals. In short, this ethic changes the role of Homo sapiens from conqueror to being a plain member of the community. And it implies the respect for the fellow members. So that kind of, it feels like for me that embodies a bit of why I'm involved in the program, and I think why a lot of people are too. Steve, what about you?
Great. Thanks, Caitlin, and thanks, Bart. Yeah, so I'm here to speak from the water users' perspective of the program. And I guess I would start by pointing out when the programs were first originated back in the late 80s and early 90s, there were two overarching goals. One was to allow water development to proceed unhindered by ESA issues, and one to recover the 4 fish species. I would argue that we have and continue to meet both of those goals. Certainly from the water user's perspective, we have. What the program has done for us is provide what I would say certainty. And Julie Stolle kind of outlined some of the numbers early on. The programs have provided ESA compliance to like 2,500 water development projects in the Upper Basin. It's close to 3 million acre feet of water that's been developed. And all that's happened without any litigation, without any ESA issues. So from the water user's perspective, I would argue it's just been a very, very, very successful program.
Awesome, thanks. So one other kind of really big question for you both. I'm hoping that you can share some success stories or big successes of the program from your perspective, and then some of the biggest challenges that the program has had to deal with. So you guys can take that and break it down however you want.
Go ahead, Bart.
Well, sure. Thanks. I'll go with successes first. I think one of the great things about the program is it's been able to be flexible. I mean, it's an adaptive management program, so it's taking in new information all the time and figuring out more about what the 4 listed species need. And a great example of it is just this past summer, 2022. For many years now, the Green River has been folks managing the dams, folks managing the program have been trying to do some experiments in the river, and that involves both increasing the base flows to benefit habitat, but also doing something called the larval trigger, which is trying to find out when the larvae are emerging and find ways to get them into some suitable habitat, let them grow and make some of those fish healthier, get through the first summer. And what happened is, folks might remember, the drought operations agreement ended up having a bunch of additional water released from Flaming Gorge Reservoir to make its way down to Lake Powell, kind of stabilize levels there. And the Fish and Wildlife Service and the program was involved enough that they actually helped shape when that water was coming down, and it really had a benefit. I just read a little bit on the website where in the Green River, there were like 3,300 wild spawn razorback sucker, which was more than twice as much as the past 10 years combined in one of the rearing areas called Stewart Lake. So the ability to kind of seize opportunities like drought operations is a really hallmark of the program. And one other quick one I'll say is just the collaborative nature of the program. It's states, it's water users, it's tribes, it's conservation groups, and the relationships built through the program have not just helped the program, they've helped other projects across the basin.
So yeah, from my perspective, I guess the success is, I would reinforce what Bart just said, the collaborative nature of the program. All the partners are at the table, all the partners are part of the discussion, and they're making the decisions, generally on a consensus-based approach. So that's why I would argue the program's been so successful. One challenge from the water user's perspective, and maybe it's a good challenge that I've seen both previously in Wyoming and here in Colorado, the program's been so successful that a lot of water users don't even know it exists because they've never been impacted by ESA issues. They go along in their daily lives using their water and have never had to deal with it. So maybe that's a good thing. I would think a little more education to water users on that perspective is important to understand what the program has done for them over the long term.
That's a great example. It's a bit invisible, right? And successful enough that most people don't know it's there. So that means I'm glad all the 50 people on this call can talk about it, talk it up, know more about it. I'll add a challenge or two. Just to wrap up from my standpoint is I think a real big one over the last 10 years is non-native fish, the predator fish. They've really exploded in populations. There are very few places left in the basin that don't have pike, northern pike or smallmouth bass, some of these species that predate in the natives. And I think even bigger issue is the drought. The drought over the last 20 years has been really hard on everybody, all water users. It's kind of messed with that certainty that Steve was talking about, but for the fish, it's been hard too. And my concern is that there's so much attention now on drought, on what we're going to do about it across the basin, that the highlight or the additional element of what happens with the fish and the environment might get lost. It might seem as a frill or an edge issue. It's not. I mean, if we want to keep having compliance with the ESA, kind of make it seamless and invisible, as Steve was talking about, we still have to take care of the fish. And so I think as we deal with the drought, as we deal with changing operations of reservoirs or management of water generally, there are going to be some real opportunities to continue to benefit fish. You know, we're adding back water to a system because we've got system conservation pilot projects. If we have demand management programs in a couple of years, whatever we do, there's literally billions of dollars coming to the Colorado River Basin now. And some of that money, at least in the upper basin, I think can help water users, help communities, and also help fish. So that's what I think is a challenge and an opportunity.
Yeah, good point. I would point out maybe one more quick challenge. Every year, a group of the partners go back to DC to advocate for the programs, make sure the authorizations and the funding is there. Every year, they see the price tag of the programs, which I think it looks very expensive on paper. It's been several $100 million over the life of the programs to operate them. I would argue that's cheaper than going the other route of having ESA issues and litigation, but still politically to go justify, every year we have to go justify for more money on these programs and to show that sufficient progress. I think because of the partners that go back every year, we've been able to do that. But I think every year it's going to get a little tougher selling certain political entities on these programs.
You're right about that.
All right. Anything else to add, Bart, Steve?
Well, there's a question in the chat, and it's probably either for Julie or Bart, I would guess.
I'm gonna hope Julie can answer that.
Yep, I'm typing frantically. You will have a response in the chat in just a moment.
Then at this point, I'd like to invite everyone else to type any questions into the chat, or if you want to raise your hand, you can do that, or just step in and voice any questions you have.
Quiet crowd, we put them all to sleep.
Bart or Julie, can you say anything more about what's being done about the non-native predator fish?
Yeah, I can speak to it a little bit. It's not something the NGOs are much involved in, but there's quite a bit of effort. It's kind of state by state through different wildlife agencies, but there have been a lot of efforts to remove, and more recently lethal removal of the non-native fish. That means, you know, taking them out and not putting them back in some other place. There've been creative things like fish derbies, and you know, that's where there's a non-native population and a reservoir where people are encouraged to go and fish, and maybe the bag limits are adjusted. I think that's correct. Julie can correct me if I'm wrong. It's this interesting thing is some of these reservoirs never had non-natives. Somebody in dark of night put some in, and now the population has grown. But one of the management actions has been to try to fix that by having kind of a focused effort of fishing. I'll let Julie talk more about that because she knows a lot more about it.
Yeah, thanks for getting me started. I think you keyed in on some of our most important efforts, and the states have been really supportive of this effort. We have must-kill regulations for these 3 species in Wyoming and Utah. So if you catch them, you're actually not allowed to put them back in the water. So I think that is a really strong message from those 2 states that these are really unacceptable species. Colorado has unlimited catch for all of these species on the western slope. So you are encouraged to go out and catch as many of them as humanly possible, and trying to get anglers involved in that effort and supporting the program is going to be one of our major focuses over the next few years. I think one of the other things that I want to mention, because we spend about $2 million right now with crews going out and physically removing these species from the landscape. It's really expensive. It's not super effective. But it's the only tool we have in the toolbox to really keep these populations at a level where the endangered fish have a chance to survive. And one of the other efforts that came out of Flaming Gorge Dam with the DROA releases this year was called a smallmouth bass flow spike. And what we're seeing is that is a single action that can occur from a reservoir that wiped out about 75% of the expected population in 2021. So this is, we can't get rid of adults that way, but we can prevent or limit reproduction in those areas that really allow us to maybe get a better handle on those populations at a basin-wide scale.
And related to that question, we just had a question in the chat come in, are carp a problem? And if so, are you doing anything about them?
Yeah, carp are not one of our big focal species. They don't have a lot of impact in the river systems, but they do when they get into some of these managed wetlands that we're trying to grow baby suckers in and stuff like that. They can basically outcompete a lot of the suckers and sort of take all of the growth for themselves rather than for those systems. So we have screened all of those off-channel wetlands. So we try and prevent all of those adults from coming in and actually drying up the wetlands from time to time during some years has helped reset those systems so that we don't have carp in them. Grass carp is one species that we are worried about in the river, and we catch some every now and then, but we're watching it, but it hasn't become a big problem quite yet.
Another question, which members of Congress are your advocates for the reauthorization legislation? Who do we need to educate and support in order to meet the September timeline for reauthorization? And then this person says, as a former staffer on the Natural Resources Committee in the House, it's important we start to work with them earlier rather than later to meet the legislative calendar.
Sure. So as long as I've been in the program, which is about 15 years now, we've had good support from all 4 Upper Basin states congressional offices and the authorizing committees. Everybody's been very supportive, very willing to have the conversation. I think where we tend to get some pushback is the appropriation committees when they're trying to balance budgets and we're coming to them with certain dollar amounts. That's where we tend to see, at least in my experience, a little bit more of the pushback. And I see Christine Arbogast just turned on her camera, and maybe she's got something to add because she spends her life back there.
Hi, everyone. I was around when the San Juan program was created, so this is bringing back a lot of memories. But you know, we have got, as Steve said, we have really strong bipartisan support from within the delegations, but there is a resistance on the House majority side on the authorizing committee to these programs and their cost. We're going to have to have extremely persuasive stories to tell to overcome that. And the other challenge that you're going to have is the new requirement by the House majority, at least on that side, that not only do you have to have a pay for, but you have to also propose paying for the program and additional cuts elsewhere. And so this reauthorization is going to be a big challenge. And I would just encourage a strategy that that is focused on the Senate moving first in order to get to sort of put the House in a position to say, to have to respond to what the Senate's already passed. And with strong bipartisan support within the delegations, you know, you may have a chance in the Senate to get this UC'd or unanimous consent. In that way, you're moving way down the road before you have to face the resistance on the House side. Thanks for letting me chime in.
Thanks, Christine.
Thanks, Christine. You know, we're at 2 o'clock, but we have a couple more questions. So if our panelists and everyone else feels like sticking around, I'll read them off and we'll see if we can get them answered. So one of them is pretty simple. What will the bill be titled this year?
Sounds like a Michelle question.
It probably is, and I don't think we've seen anything on what the title will be. We can let you know. It might be, you know, something as simple as, you know, reauthorization of, but I don't know. When it's introduced, we can try to reach out to some of the folks that typically help give us that support in those DC briefings, to make sure they're on top of it and they know finally, and especially once we get, you know, a bill number, which really helps, right? So then we'll be able to share that. But right now, we don't know. The draft we have does not have a draft title, and I suspect that our sponsors will probably work with us on that, as well as some of the strategy that Christina discussed much better than I can, but there will be a lot of discussion, I think. We do know of some of the senators that are already interested in sponsoring and working with them on what they think is appropriate in terms of strategy, title, timeline, and all those things. So they can be working with their colleagues to keep this moving forward.
Do we have any idea what time of year, Michelle, just to be on the lookout for it?
No, we're going to try to get the draft language to them in the next couple of weeks, but when they choose to introduce it will be based on when they think the right timing is. And so that's a discussion that isn't finished yet. I know there are some calls scheduled in the next few weeks to discuss that in more detail. So unfortunately, I don't know at this time.
Okay. Is that something that we could have posted to us somehow as a group that attended this meeting today?
I'm happy to email that out if maybe Michelle, if you can notify me, or if someone can make sure that I'm in the loop. I'm happy to share that with everyone.
Yep, trying to make a note of that now. And yeah, Caitlin, if you could forward, that would be fantastic.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So we had one last question typed into the chat. It's interesting. So it says these programs and the similar one in the Platte River Basin seem to be good models. Are there situations or species where these types of recovery programs combined with ESA compliance have been successful outside of the river or water management context, maybe nationwide? Is there something inherent in water-related situations that makes these types of approaches work?
Yeah,
Boy, it's a really good question, I guess. To the second part, certainly water does not always lead to a good, successful program. And we can see some of the issues and problems that have happened in Bay Delta and the Klamath over water and fish species. I'm sure there are some success with relative to non-water management, and maybe Julie's more familiar with that. She's working that area.
Yeah, I think, first of all, I think there's something special in these programs that have mainly to do with the people who have formed them and dedicated their lives to making sure that they stay successful here. I don't think it's a coincidence that all three of the programs that you name started in Colorado, because I think that's where a lot of the collaboration came from. The Upper Colorado program was the first of its kind in Fish and Wildlife Service history. So it was a very strange program when it first started. And now they have an entire section of the Endangered Species Act called 7A1 dedicated to collaborative conservation models that are trying to offset ESA compliance or to make it easier. Most of the land-based ones are called habitat conservation plans or HCPs, but they essentially do the same thing as these programs do. The one thing that I do think is different in most of those cases is, recovery still remains our goal. So we are trying to get the species back on the landscape. And depending on how those agreements are set up, a lot of those programs are based only on offsetting the negative impacts rather than trying to get the species back to a fully recovered status.
And honestly, I think I'm going to add, having grown up in areas where federal agency and local communities battling over species issues hasn't worked out as well. I would say things like the Colorado Water Congress stepping up and saying, we can do this better, right? There's a vision for working together. That was huge. And then to have the agencies, the water users, the states, and it was probably difficult at first. I wasn't there at the beginning, but I heard it took a little while to get into rhythm and to trust each other. But people came in, I think, wanting to make it work, wanting to learn to trust each other and learn to work together. And I think that if you can get a program started, which Water Congress suggested, before you hit that point where nobody trusts each other anymore, it's a lot easier to get people to come to the table and give it a shot and try to work together, which works together on so many levels. Financially, politically, everything works better this way. It's much easier to get support to do things this way. But if you've waited until things are very, very broken, I think it's much harder. But I think in terms of whether it's water or not, I don't think so. But I think it's that vision from somebody that it's time to step in and try to get people to work together before it gets out of hand is really a key piece.
Right. With that, I would like to, thank our speakers. Thanks to everyone for being here today. It was a great discussion, great questions. We all learned a lot. So thanks, everyone. I will, a reminder that we recorded this. So I will aim to send that out in the next few days, next week, definitely. And with that, have a great afternoon. Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Caitlin.
Thank you.